Throughout history, science and medicine have advanced humanity, but they've also pushed the boundaries of ethics, often with horrifying consequences. Today, we're exploring the most unethical experiments ever conducted on humans. Stories so shocking they force us to question what humanity is capable of in the pursuit of knowledge. Prepare yourself for a journey through the dark side of scientific curiosity. Number 1. The Tuskegee syphilis study, 1932 to 1972. The Tuskegee study is one of the most infamous cases of medical abuse in U.S. history. Over 600 African American men in Alabama, 399 of whom had syphilis, were enrolled in a study without their informed consent. The men were promised free health care, but were never treated for syphilis, even after penicillin became a recognized cure. The participants were misled, thinking they were receiving genuine medical treatment. Instead, doctors observed as their health deteriorated, causing blindness, mental instability, and death. The deception extended beyond the individuals. Their families also suffered as the disease spread. Despite their suffering, researchers withheld life-saving treatments for nearly 40 years, prioritizing their experiment over human lives. The study ended after a whistleblower leaked it to the press in 1972, resulting in widespread outrage and reforms in research ethics, including the creation of the Belmont Report. Number 2. Unit 731, Japan's Biological Warfare Program, 1937 to 1945. Unit 731 conducted experiments so inhumane they are often compared to the Nazi atrocities. Prisoners of war and civilians were subjected to biological weapons testing and inhumane surgeries in Manchuria. Diseases such as anthrax and plague were deliberately unleashed on human subjects to study their effects. Prisoners were often vivisected while still alive, without anesthesia, to observe organ damage in real time. Others were exposed to freezing conditions to study frostbite, with their limbs deliberately maimed to document the effects. These heinous acts weren't just wartime experiments, they were crimes against humanity on an unimaginable scale. Shockingly, many of the perpetrators were granted immunity in exchange for their data by Allied forces after World War II. Survivors and their families have fought for recognition of these atrocities ever since. Number 3. The MK-Ultra Project, 1953 to 1973. The CIA's secret MK-Ultra program was a Cold War era experiment in mind control. Using unsuspecting individuals, the CIA tested drugs, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation to control human behavior. LSD was frequently administered to participants without their knowledge or consent. One of the most controversial cases involved Frank Olson, a scientist who was allegedly drugged without his knowledge. His mental health deteriorated rapidly, and he died under mysterious circumstances. Initially ruled a suicide, but later suspected to involve foul play. The program also targeted marginalized communities, exploiting their vulnerabilities in the name of national security. The program was only revealed during Senate hearings in the 1970s. To this day, many questions about MK-Ultra remain unanswered, shrouded in secrecy and conspiracy. Number 4. The Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo set up a mock prison to study how power dynamics affect human behavior. Volunteer students were randomly assigned roles as guards or prisoners. However, within days, the guards began abusing their authority and prisoners suffered extreme emotional distress. The guards invented degrading punishments, including forcing prisoners to perform humiliating tasks and denying them food or bathroom access. Some prisoners had breakdowns, crying uncontrollably and begging to leave. Zimbardo, acting as the prison superintendent, allowed the abuse to escalate unchecked. Although the experiment was halted after just 6 days, it exposed how easily humans can descend into cruelty when given unchecked power, a lesson that remains relevant in discussions about systemic abuse today. Number 5. The Willowbrook Hepatitis Experiments, 1950s to 1960s. At the Willowbrook State School for Children with Intellectual Disabilities, researchers deliberately infected children with hepatitis to study the progression of the disease and test potential treatments. Consent was often coerced from parents, who were told participation was a condition for admission. The children, already vulnerable due to their disabilities, were subjected to painful and invasive procedures. Many suffered severe complications, and some faced lifelong health issues. Critics have condemned these experiments as a flagrant violation of medical ethics, exploiting the powerless for scientific gain. Public outrage eventually led to Willowbrook's closure, but the experiments serve as a haunting reminder of the dangers of prioritizing research over human dignity. Number 6. The Monster Study, 1939. Conducted by Wendell Johnson, this experiment aimed to study the effects of positive versus negative reinforcement on speech development. Orphan children were divided into groups. One received positive encouragement, while the other was harshly criticized for every speech mistake. The children subjected to negative reinforcement developed severe anxiety and, in some cases, lifelong speech impediments. This group became withdrawn, with some losing the ability to speak confidently altogether. The psychological scars endured for decades, showcasing the profound harm caused by unethical experimentation. The study was later disavowed, and surviving participants received an apology decades after enduring its damaging effects. Number 7. The Aversion Project, 1970s to 1980s. In apartheid-era South Africa, military personnel subjected LGBTQ+ soldiers to cruel conversion experiments. Participants were chemically castrated, subjected to electroshock therapy, and forced to undergo reassignment surgeries against their will. These experiments were justified under the guise of curing homosexuality, reflecting the era's deep-seated prejudice. Survivors reported enduring years of mental and physical suffering, with many experiencing severe trauma long after the experiments ended. Families were often kept in the dark, adding to the victims' isolation. The Aversion Project is now recognized as a gross violation of human rights, sparking calls for accountability and reparations. Number 8. Experiments in North Korean prison camps, ongoing. Defectors and human rights organizations have reported horrific experiments on prisoners in North Korea. Victims are allegedly used to test biological and chemical weapons, enduring agonizing deaths. Reports detail instances where prisoners were placed in gas chambers or deliberately infected with diseases. These experiments are shrouded in secrecy, with survivors recounting unimaginable suffering. The lack of international access to these camps makes verifying these accounts difficult but not less alarming. Such stories highlight the continuing need for global pressure on regimes accused of systemic human rights abuses. Number 9. Radiation experiments in the US, 1940s to 1960s. During the Cold War, the US government conducted secret experiments to study the effects of radiation. Unsuspecting patients, including pregnant women and cancer patients, were exposed to harmful doses of radiation without informed consent. In some cases, radioactive material was injected directly into patients, while others were subjected to experimental treatments under false pretenses. Many suffered from radiation poisoning, cancers, and other health complications, with no knowledge of the risks they were subjected to. The experiments only came to light decades later, forcing the government to compensate victims and implement stricter ethical guidelines. Number 10. Guatemala syphilis experiments, 1946 to 1948. Led by the US, researchers deliberately infected Guatemalan prisoners, soldiers, and mental patients with syphilis and other STDs to test the efficacy of penicillin. The participants were not informed or treated properly. The experiment involved deliberately exposing individuals to infected sex workers or directly injecting them with the disease. Many were left untreated, leading to severe health consequences. The program was conducted under the pretense of advancing medical science, but left a legacy of suffering and betrayal. The US formally apologized for the experiments in 2010, but the damage to the victims and their families remains irreparable. History is full of stories that highlight the dangers of unchecked power and scientific ambition. These unethical experiments remind us of the importance of prioritizing human dignity above all else. Let these dark chapters serve as lessons to ensure that the pursuit of knowledge never comes at the cost of humanity.